FBI Counterterrorism Hotline, Special Agent Truesdale speaking.
Yeah, I got some information on several Americans who have been funding and equipping terrorists and terrorist organizations.
Okay, sir. Hold on 1 second here. Yeah, okay, go ahead, sir.
All right, one of them's already dead. You still going to be able to use this tip, or...
Sir, yes. Any information you have may prevent a terrorist act.
All right, good. That's what I thought. Then the first name is Ronald Reagan. R-E-A-G... Yep. Hello? Hello?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, إنما ذلكم الشيطان يخوف أولياءه فلا تخافوهم وخافوني إن كنتم مؤمنين. And what means in translation, it is only the Satan, the Shaitan, that suggests to you the fear of his helpers and companions. But do not be afraid of them, but fear me, if you believe. Good evening, brothers and sisters, and thank you for having me this evening to this event on behalf of our brother Tarek. It is an honor to speak to all of you tonight. I read the verse of the Quran from Surah Al-Imran, which suggests that one of the tests we as human beings go through in this world is the test of fear, khawf. And that Allah Ta'ala will test us by putting us in situations where we will be fearful of consequences, so much so that we may submit to the tactics of the evil forces of the world, here identified as Shaitan and his minions. And we find that we, as Muslims in the West, are commonly tested by the demands of the dominant non-Muslim society to prove that we are more like them, or less like us, or not like the bad Muslims, and much more like those that respect American values and their way of life, whatever these broad categorizations might mean. As a consequence, we therefore find ourselves confronted when we desire to express ourselves openly with explicit and implicit threats that more often than not, unfortunately, we allow to instill in us a compromise that selects silence and indifference where action and activism are more appropriate. Well, I would like to describe, inshallah, a little bit this evening some of the manifestations of this reality, about the way a culture of fear has been created, and how I believe Tarek Mehanna is being punished for refusing to submit to that culture of fear. And also what I think we, as a community, can and should do about it, inshallah. As the brother said on November the 11th, 2008, Tarek Mehanna, then a 27-year-old graduate of the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy with a doctorate degree, was pulled off a plane on his way to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where he was to engage in full-time employment, working for a hospital, having been the subject of brutal police harassment over the previous years. He was officially denied exit from the United States and was instead pulled off the plane and charged with the crime of lying to the FBI when questioned about whether he knowingly held a conversation with fellow Muslim Daniel Maldonado, a person that allegedly had moved to the Middle East without the aid of Tarek Mehanna, had then found his way to Somalia without the aid of Tarek Mehanna, where an indigenous Islamic group, the Islamic Courts Union, or the ICU, had come to power and implemented the first sign of safety and security the war-torn nation had experienced in approximately 20 years, as documented vividly by mainstream press, including BBC. These happenings in Somalia occurred as well, without the aid of Tarek Mehanna. well, the security in Somalia would not last long. The ICU would soon be overthrown in a proxy invasion by Ethiopia, armed and supported by the United States, thus deeming them and anyone providing support to them terrorists, albeit terrorists that Tarek Mehanna himself had absolutely no direct connection to. Daniel Maldonado, on the other hand, as Ethiopia invaded, with its high new-tech weaponry, a gift from its new U.S. ally, and as the U.S. parked a warship off the coast of the country, providing logistical and aerial backup to an attack that fits the definition of terrorism to a T, fled to neighboring Kenya, only to be arrested and charged for training with a group on the U.S. terror list. Because Daniel Maldonado allegedly telephoned Tarek Mehanna out of the blue from Somalia, again without the request or foreknowledge of our brother Tarek, he would be charged with lying to the FBI for allegedly saying that he believed Maldonado was in Egypt, and, if these allegations are true, for attempting to protect his brother in faith from U.S. authorities notorious for terrorizing any and all individuals or political movements that come to power under paradigms different than their own. Tarek Mehanna was charged only after he refused to become an FBI informant and was given bail early then on the minor charge. However, as we heard, only months later, the FBI would again remove him from safety and security, this time from the comforts of his own home, in front of his own family, under allegations that he was planning to engage in terrorism himself, was involved in a conspiracy to attack civilians at a local mall with automatic weapons, and most recently that he was, quote, conspiring to provide material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations, namely Al-Qaeda, unquote. This, as we heard earlier, a result of his work translating documents from Arabic into English, mostly by ancient Islamic scholars that have been dead for centuries. During this ordeal, we have seen all too well how a case like Tarek's can be utilized to craft a culture of fear. The media was quick to highlight his praise for Al-Qaeda in recorded conversations, his alleged plan to attack civilians at a shopping mall, and his violent disregard for life. However, for anybody that knew Tarek Mehanna personally, it was apparent that this would simply not be the case. Tarek Mehanna was as active speaking out against indiscriminate attacks against civilians as he was against U.S. foreign policy generally, its occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, its unconditional support for Israel, its propping up of proxy dictators, and etc. Needless to say, none of these realities made it into the widespread press coverage, and for those that did not know anything about Tarek personally, it is very easy to understand how they could imagine that the allegations against him were true. Even in the Muslim community, independent and influential Muslim press played to the tune of the authorities. A very popular organization was quick to classify him a, quote, overzealous, angry, and impetuous youth, and, quote, that it is not surprising that someone who openly revels in the actions of foreign terrorist groups and exudes happiness anytime something bad happens to the people of the land that he lives in will eventually come under suspicion and charged with some type of crime, regardless of whether he is actually guilty of that crime or not, unquote. The article was later removed wisely, but it is an example of how far a climate of fear can come to create a culture which breeds inactivity. Inactivity more often than not proclaimed as seeking constructive dialogue, but in reality seeking appeasement and silence in the face of atrocity. Still, the evidence against Tarek even today is flimsy to say the least. The criminal complaint is full of testimony, predominantly from two cooperating witnesses, one of whom apparently agreed to work with authorities after incriminating himself in FBI interviews, and another a convicted felon, facing at least 2.5 years in prison on a gun charge, at least until he agreed to utilize his friendship with Tarek to get out of trouble. The FBI called him the first significant cooperator who began assisting investigators at a critical time when, quote, our ability to use other evidence was uncertain, unquote. Thus, Tarek's trial will be dependent on the word of two individuals that were both themselves looking at prison time and the way out, along with some far-fetched fairy tales and accusations of intended violence, sandwiched between data and recorded conversations that show nothing more than that Tarek Mehanna was absolutely opposed to U.S. foreign policy, especially as it pertains to violating Muslims, but not that he was engaged in actually illegal activities. Our brother Tarek is not alone. There have been over 30 cases in the United States that have utilized the information of undercover informants as primary testimony in cases where the accusations were so severe, there is no way that plots could have even been pondered without the insertion of coercion or incitement by an informant that is not only pushing, prodding, and encouraging acts of violence, but is accessorizing and more often than not supplying the logistics and supplies necessary for the engagement of such acts. In early 2007, for example, 24-year-old Pakistani immigrant Shahawar Mateen Siraj was sentenced to 30 years in prison for plotting to bomb the Herald Square subway station in downtown Manhattan. Siraj was set up by an undercover informant that pushed the bomb. The undercover had spent several months with his victim, convincing him of his Islamic duty to engage in jihad against civilians. The informant was to supply the explosives, the funding, and even came up with the idea with the plan. He didn't start taping Siraj until after he had thoroughly radicalized him. In the wake of the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the torture of Bagram and Abu Ghraib. At the last minute, Siraj, with a backpack full of fake explosives, decided not to go through with the attack and turned toward the informant saying that he didn't want to kill anybody, that he had to ask his mother first. It was too late. 5 days later, he was arrested and would be convicted to 30 years of imprisonment as a result. On February 21st, 2009, Abdullah Niazi, a 34-year-old Afghan immigrant, was arrested in Orange County, California, and charged with perjury and passport fraud for lying to an undercover informant. The media blew the case out of proportion, emphasizing and repeating that the accused had been reported referring to Osama bin Laden as an angel, and claiming to have a brother-in-law that was a high-ranking member of the Taliban. The claim was discovered to be a fraud and exaggeration told to undercover informant Craig Montley. The informant, only 18 months earlier, had been kicked out of a mosque in Irvine, California, after trying to draw individuals into a plot to blow up shopping malls and abandoned buildings. When the mosque petitioned the authorities to undertake an investigation, they refused. The informant, we now know, had earned tens of thousands of dollars in payments from the FBI in return for spying on Muslims, and thanks to local journalism from Orange County, we also know that at the same time he was entrapping Muslims, he was running illegal scams on females from his local gym, posing as a distributor of steroids or illegal growth hormones, and eventually going back to jail for conning 2 women out of more than $150,000. He was an informant with a lengthy criminal record, an informant that had agreed to work with the authorities while he was incarcerated, and the primary source of several complaints by Muslims themselves to local authorities for loudly espousing his desire to engage in terrorism and trying to lead others to follow and cooperate. The use of informants is typical in nearly all cases against Muslims since 9/11. But the role they play in exaggerating and manipulating the actual data cannot be underestimated. Typically, they are all criminal convicts. And the people they are infiltrating have no criminal record whatsoever, and no previous expressed intent to engage in any violent act whatsoever. Take the other recent case of the Newburgh Four from upstate New York, a case that is coming to trial as we speak, where 4 Muslim men stand accused of plotting to blow up a synagogue in Riverdale, New York. The informant in this case had already been responsible for entrapping 2 other members of the upstate New York Muslim community and would sit outside the local masjid in his Mercedes, espousing radical views while also offering free meals, jobs, advice, and other assistance. While most of the community already fingered him as a provocateur, the 4 men, naive and poor, were enticed not by the inference rhetoric so much as they were by his bankroll, his money, and they proceeded to gain thousands of dollars, cell phones, and computers during their interactions with him, until the informant offered to accessorize the blowing up of the synagogue and funded the entire thing. The informant, it turns out, was a Pakistani immigrant who was to be convicted and probably deported in the wake of 9/11 for driver's license fraud. That is, until he agreed to work with the FBI as an undercover. Similarly, in 2006, the notorious Fort Dix case witnessed 5 men deemed suspect after they were caught on tape by a store clerk riding horseback, having a pillow fight, shooting legal guns at a legal firing range, and stating with their tongues, Allahu Akbar, infiltrated by 2 agent provocateurs, both Muslim men, previously convicted themselves of serious crimes as well. These agents suggested an attack on Fort Dix. They came up with the idea. They gave significant amounts of money and continuously encouraged the defendants to watch jihadi videos and remark on their political views. The informants in this case were so aggressive in coercing their victims that after repeated requests for maps at Fort Dix, one of the defendants caved in and submitted a map. But he recorded the conversation and submitted it to the FBI. However, the FBI refused to accept that conversation on the grounds that it was irrelevant. The investigation continued, and eventually they were charged with accessorizing in a plot concocted and planned not by them, but by the informant altogether. The list goes on. In September of last year, Michael C. Finton was charged with attempting to blow up the Paul Findley Federal Building in Springfield, Illinois. His case was crafted by an informant who claimed to be a bomb supplier for Al-Qaeda. Finton was incited and led to believe that a truck full of explosives would be detonated by a cell phone given to him by the informant. In this case, the informant came up with the idea, supplied the bombs, the truck, and all he had to do was convince his target to agree to simply call a cell phone number and initiate the explosion. A similar case, publicized on the same day, revealed that yet another man, Hosam Mehar Hussein Smedley, age 19 from Dallas, Texas, who drew the FBI's attention because of his participation on Islamist sites over the internet, was coerced by another informant to park a van that he believed was full of explosives under an office building in downtown Dallas. Of course, the agent provided the explosives, concocted the plan, and only had to convince his victim to participate. Colleen Rose, known as Jihad Jane, was charged with trying to murder cartoonist Lars Vilks in Sweden after an unidentified co-conspirator incited her to travel and seek out the act. Recently, the arrest of 2 young men in New Jersey involved an informant that offered to allow his victims to use property he owned in Egypt to hold over at until they could proceed on to Somalia, where they were to engage in jihad. There are many cases with similar circumstances. As the brother said, if you pay attention only to what the media says, you would suggest that they have actual evidence for these charges. Closer scrutiny reveals that we must always be people that verify information. We must always verify and look for the factual evidences in cases against the Muslims. We are certainly targets. This is obvious. That's not the only way it works. Imam Fuad Farahi, the imam of the mosque attended by Jose Padilla, the so-called dirty bomber, reports that after being questioned about his relationship with Padilla and another, he was asked by the FBI to work for them as an informant. His student visa had expired, and the U.S. knew that he had to ask the government for a renewal and was thus vulnerable. Over a 5-year period of time, after refusing to work for them, the FBI proceeded to threaten him with deportation and even the charging of terrorism in order to coerce him to work for them. The Council of Arab-Islamic Relations, or CARE, suspects that there are hundreds of cases, in fact, where Muslims have been threatened with deportation or criminal charges if they refuse to cooperate as informants. But the question that must be asked is whether or not the practices included in Tarek's case and others like them are preventing real terror threats at all, or creating cases that would otherwise be non-existent, and thereby instigating McCarthy-like era practices of justification for broader wars and oppressions. The public announcement of arrest and charge is usually followed, as we heard earlier, by a media blitz that floods the general population with the idea that supporters of Al-Qaeda were planning these attacks on their own, and that they were somehow intercepted by noble FBI agents who saved the day in the nick of time, preventing the carrying out of the act. When, if ever, news is revealed that suggests the agents may have themselves incited the acts, it is never as widespread as the looped press coverage during the immediate aftermath. In this manner, by creating crimes that otherwise would not have occurred, or commenting on crimes that are mostly the imaginary fabrication of informants, a culture of fear is concocted, and the means of law enforcement is no longer neutral, but intended to obtain preconceived political ends. In Tarek's case, the charge that they were planning to attack shopping malls is built solely on the testimony of a cooperating witness. Actually, I guess he's not even physically charged with that. But if you would have seen the media about the case, it would suggest that that was what the whole case was based upon. For 3 days straight, we heard about the interception of an Al-Qaeda cell and a terrorist that was planning to attack civilians at shopping malls. Read the indictment and you'll find that it was the word of a person who himself was trying to stay out of prison. Just the hearsay of a confidential informant. Of course, it is the most excessive of the allegations the media focuses on, emphasizing repeatedly the severity of the plot, and sending a message that is sure to implant itself firmly on the subconscious of all those listening, whether attentively or preferably in passing by. An audience that cares little for detail and is quite comfortable with the simplistic narrative offered by network and cable news outlets. In nearly each of these cases, journalists interviewing associates or neighbors or family members of the victims of the entrapment reveal that they cannot believe the accused would commit such heinous crimes. That's because they would not have. While apparently neutral and balanced commentary, this has the actual effect of convincing the public that anyone, any Muslim, while appearing as a peaceful member of society, may very well be plotting attacks in America. And it's hard to imagine the law enforcement practices and mainstream press coverage are not deliberate. As Noam Chomsky, MIT professor from Massachusetts here, has described, the function of the media as propaganda is to democracy what the bludgeon is to the totalitarian state. The only threat to this system of control is people like Tarek Mehanna. People with the courage to denounce the misinformation and stand up in the face of its aggression. In fact, not allowing himself to be bullied by the coercion of authority was Tarek's major crime. His case is as much the outcome of targeted harassment and persecution as it is effective terror prevention. But in climates like ours today, dissidents increasingly confront the utilization not only of unjust law enforcement practices, but of an interpretation of the law that prefers the bludgeon. The post-9/11 era is replete with terror cases that are initiated by government agents, and that would all be impossible without the claims of informants that they have access to the weapons, explosives, or materials that would make the plots possible. It is safe to say that in every case, even if the defendants had some inclination to commit an act of terror, which I might add is hardly believable in all of the cases, they could not have obtained the resources necessary to carry them out, or would not have tried due to the enormous difficulty and lack of technical know-how. It is also interesting to note that when real terror cases do occur, which are almost always planned and initiated overseas, they never cover the specifics of the statements or calls, or why they engaged in efforts to attack Americans. A recent example of this was the Faisal Shahzad arrest. Shahzad was effectively radicalized after witnessing the effects of American drone attacks in Pakistan and their normal killing of civilians rather than their intended military targets. This led him to desire carrying out indiscriminate attacks against civilians, foreign policy and the effects of it that he witnessed, not the hatred of liberalism or democracy. However, the mainstream press chooses rather to emphasize the fact that he showed no remorse in the courtroom, that he was stone cold, and neglected his emphasis on U.S. foreign policy altogether as cause. Likewise, when Joseph Stack, a non-Muslim, flew his private airplane into an IRS building a few months ago, he left a lengthy suicide note mentioning the oppressive nature of domestic American politics and citing his position that the U.S. government constantly caters to an oligarchic business class. But for its part, the mainstream press did not cover his act as an act of terrorism. They did, however, emphasize questioning of his sanity, and for the most part failed altogether to mention the domestic oppression and consequential hopelessness he cited as true cause. Still, all of these cases led to, or seemingly will lead to, conviction. The reason is due to the nature of the definition of entrapment as defined in the American legal canon, and the social climate of passivity and non-resistance. Usually, a successful entrapment defense requires the defendant to prove three things. Firstly, the idea of committing the crime came from the law enforcement officers, rather than from the defendant himself. And secondly, that the law enforcement officers induced the person to commit the crime. These two evidences are what are known as objective proofs. They have to deal with the nature of the law enforcement tactics and approach. In nearly all of the cases we discussed, the idea came from the officers. The attack would not have been possible without their offering supplies and other assistance, and there is oftentimes ample proof of coaxing and coercion. However, the other side of an entrapment case is what is called the subjective proof, where it must be established that the, quote, defendant was not ready and willing to commit this type of crime before being induced to do so. And this is where we have the conundrum that oftentimes leads to prosecution. Most courts allow a defendant's predisposition to be demonstrated through prior conduct or reputation, thus alluding to the website. This is why the majority of case complaints and indictments are usually concocted and exaggerated charges that would prove scanty based on evidence alone. However, they are always surrounded by proliferate amounts of character assassination, showing the extremist views of the defendant. Add these to a general climate of widespread fear and Islamist scare, and one can imagine how hard it is to win a jury trial today as a Muslim with an entrapment defense. In Tarek's case, not unlike others, this is represented sort of, not to a T, but sort of, in the constant referral to his opposition of American occupation, if you read the indictment, and interference in the affairs of foreign Muslim lands. Indeed, the very last cited complaints against him read that he, quote, found it unfathomable that the United States military has military bases in the heart of the Muslim world, and that the, quote, land of Muhammad is being used as a military base to attack Muslims, unquote. And also that in the U.S. he felt like a fish out of water. These quotes are sandwiched between recorded conversations of him expressing passion for jihad, allegedly, something that is binding on every Muslim but means much more than mere physical conflict, fighting, and war. His observing videos pertaining to jihad was highlighted, and other things that are not crimes in and of themselves, but that then in the trial set the stage for what becomes the basis of a character representation that demonizes and seeks to create guilt by character association, whether or not there was any real objective data that the defendant desired to commit the crimes he is accused of. Thus the importance of turning out to show support. This is a deliberate process of the post-9/11 Patriot Act mentality. Any Muslim that espouses the belief in the right of self-determination for Muslims in Muslim lands. Any Muslim that dresses overly Islamic, that grows a beard, and that has a negative opinion of the effect of U.S. foreign policy in the world, or that generally believes Islam has a role to play in the political and economic life of Muslims, apart from U.S. domination, is a potential terrorist. This belief was academized in a report by the NYPD in 2007. The report, titled Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat, outlined a process of radicalism that consists of 4 phases: pre-radicalization, self-identification, indoctrination, and jihadization. A person is a, quote, normal good Muslim throughout the pre-radicalization stage, but initiates a pathway to hate and violence in the self-identification stage, where it is believed that a, quote, cognitive opening or crisis, which shakes one's certitude in previously held beliefs, occurs, unquote. Here, the initiation of a quest for violence is begun. When unremarkable individuals, as they say, become aware of their unremarkability, and in anger, adjust their worldview to one of alleged hate and animosity. The mainstream press has picked up on this stage and is quick to seek out exposés of radicals that document their initiation into a life of radicalism. CNN becoming much more like Fox News each and every single day. Recently aired a documentary called American Al-Qaeda, replete with lies, insinuations, and complete misunderstandings, easily identified for anybody that is on the inside of Islamic activism, but certainly not for those watching from without. The NYPD report says nothing of the true cause of so-called radicalization, namely the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, the millions that America has killed and displaced in its war on terror, the atrocities committed in places like Bagram and Guantanamo, the propping up of despots and dictators from Israel to Egypt to Saudi Arabia, and U.S. hegemony in the world generally. Instead, the report claims the individual is then radicalized by an archetypal spiritual sanctioner. Instead, and the report identifies that mosques, bookstores, cafes, prisons, and flop houses are what it calls radicalization incubators that provide, quote, extremist fodder or fuel for radicalization. So this essentially sets out the belief that radicalization is marked by clear stages, that anyone that starts to get serious about their religion, grows a beard, attends the mosque in his or her community, and goes to a bookstore, while at the same time expressing an activist-like commitment to addressing the ills and afflictions of Muslims across the globe, is one step away from embarking on the terminal stage, jihadization. The report includes that the step from radicalization to jihadization is a thin line, that the internet serves as an enabler, and that what it terms groupthink, a very dangerous term, can be one of the most important catalysts as like-minded individuals combining resources and creating what could be considered a social movement is one step away from the naming of civilians, no matter how much they may express that their goals, objectives, and methodology is peaceful and pacifist. Thereby, the report effectively identifies as a risk and criminalizes any Muslim that holds political views antagonist to American interests. It is replete with political language that is designed to make lies sound truthful and arrest and preemptive prosecution justified. It is a McCarthy-like means of avoiding the legal prevention for entrapment and usurping the rights and civil liberties of all while initiating the even more problematic realm of thought crimes. In fact, the legal provisions for institutionalizing these practices nearly passed as law in late 2007, when the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act passed through the House of Representatives, but was stunted through the work of activism, including Islamic activism. It was prevented from passing in the Senate. But this act, written by the Rand Corporation, vehement in its hatred against Islam, and backed widely by Senator Joseph Lieberman, was to initiate studies of us, Muslims, Widespread million-dollar studies of us that would have led to the adoption of very problematic definitions and had grave implications with regard to freedom of assembly and expression generally in this country. For example, the act would have defined violent radicalization as, quote, the process of adapting or promoting an extremist belief system for the purpose of facilitating ideologically based violence to advance political, religious, or social change. Sort of an oxymoron if you think of it. Another term in the act, homegrown terrorism, was defined as, quote, the planned use, threatened use of force, or violence by a group to intimidate or coerce the government of the United States, unquote. The problem is that under these definitions, any and all dissent can be classified as ideological, coercion, and speech can be categorized as planning or threat, and thus can be criminalized. In a climate of fear, acts like these pass and become law. Thus, another consequence of the homegrown terror threats that are becoming all the more frequent as time goes on. 2 weeks prior to the introduction of the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act, Brian Michael Jenkins, one of the authors from RAND, delivered testimony to a Senate subcommittee where he said, quote, homegrown terrorism is the principal threat that we face as a country, and it will likely be the principal threat that we face for decades. Unless a way of intervening in the radicalization process can be found, we are condemned to stepping on cockroaches one at a time, unquote. The threat is not confined to the Islamic community either. The act commented quite a bit on anti-globalists, anarchists, and radical environmentalists. And follows the lead of a 2005 RAND report titled Trends in Terrorism, which includes a full chapter devoted entirely to a non-Muslim homegrown terrorist threat. The danger we face is apparent, and as a community, we have two choices. We can adopt the passive role of silence, intimidation, and self-preservation, condemning whatever and whoever the government identifies as terrorists, or we can defend ourselves and demonize others in the manner of the immediate response or lack of response to Tarek's case we cited earlier. Or we can overcome our fears and reply by confronting these realities and organizing a movement that simultaneously is opposed to terrorism and oppression wherever it exists, and that calls attention to the Gestapo-like tactics that are becoming the norm. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is reported to have said that if the people witness an oppressor and they do not take him by his hands to prevent him, then they are close to Allah, covering them all with punishment. In this manner, we have to wonder when it will be our son, our daughter, our imam, or ourselves. We can learn a lot about how to go forward by the example set forth by Tarek Mehanna. Despite facing such draconian realities, locked on his cell, as was mentioned earlier, in 23-1 lockdown, because of the ideological risks that he poses, cruel punishment that suggests that innocence until proven guilty has been thrown away, and that Guantanamo Bay has been brought home to this country, his morale, as his father said, remains high. And remains as high as possible, I might add. He continues to represent the truth, maintaining his belief, knowing he is innocent, and making the most of his time to cultivate an improved consciousness. His letters from prison touched thousands of individuals. His courage and lack of fear, his trust in Allah, is setting an example that will guarantee the thought police an occupation for decades to come. One of his recent letters reads, quote, by definition, prison is a tool of confinement. The sovereignty of its inhabitants is usurped. It is characterized by limitation. It is not designed to offer much to those who it swallows into its cold gray belly, conventionally speaking. For certain people, however, there is an exception to this. For certain prisoners, there is a treasure hidden here that only they can find. It is a treasure that, when found, turns this institution of confinement upside down and inside out. It is the treasure of the very freedom that was intended to be usurped, rather a freedom greater than the one intended to be usurped. This treasure, when found, can transform a tool of confinement into a tool of liberation. And he quotes Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah reciting the verse from Surah al-Hadid, the translation of which could mean, inside it will be mercy, on the outside will be torment. Unquote from Tarek. There is much we can learn, Younus, to me, from this courage, this attitude about ourselves, about our community, about the nature of reality, and about the purpose of the human experience. Tarek's case is therefore as much about community as it is about isolated experience. And that's why I wanted to mention the other cases that have similarities here tonight. And we have failed miserably so far in mustering the courage to rise up and act on principles, thus emancipating ourselves from the indivisible prison walls that lurk in the life of the spiritually dead, despite their being free. And I'll wrap up very shortly. 2 minutes. Toward the end of the Nazi experiment, there was a form of collective punishment called Sippenhaft. It was a legalized practice in which relatives of persons accused of crimes against the state were held to share the responsibility for those crimes and subject to arrest and sometimes execution. In this way, the arrest of one was intimidation upon all, and communities started to police themselves in the knowledge that they did not only have to remain silent, but also had to encourage others to remain silent and to do so. This is the general climate that is coalescing, that is formulating, and that has been created in this post-9/11 war on Islam. But there is hope for altering these realities. Earlier this month, the case of the Newburgh Four was nearly thrown out of court on the grounds of entrapment. Because the FBI refused to submit a letter that found early on in the investigation, they knew the defendants were not a threat. And this case could set precedent for other entrapment cases, but only if we're able to make knowledge of these cases and others like them widespread and to mobilize as a Muslim community. Say what you want about Al-Qaeda and jihadist groups like them. The fact of the matter is that it is clearly not American values, but American foreign policy and interventionism that is driving Al-Qaeda. But if we allow ideas that we too share the opinion that U.S. foreign policy is oppressive and unjust, and that we cannot express that opinion, if we allow the idea and the statement to become criminalized, then we have allowed them to abolish free speech and expression altogether. During the Cold War era, and amidst the Red Scare of McCarthyism, departing President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave a farewell address, and he warned of creeping private power in America. This is in the 50s. He said that, quote, "We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together," unquote. Today, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex may be better termed as the military-industrial national security media complex, a coalition of private and government powers that has come to drown out any real practice of peaceful democratic method. The publicity of all these cases only guarantees that more tax dollars will fund expanded security measures and that more civil liberties will be exchanged for security as well, that more wars will continue and that destruction and chaos will remain the norm of the world. Despite all this, and the enormous expenditure and effort in the war on terror, the U.S. is in rapid decline, and its decline is actually increasing authoritarianism and structures of authoritarianism across the world. In this sense, this microcosm of the overall struggle for justice represents an opportunity for the oppressed and intimidated to liberate not only ourselves, but also our oppressors. We must reproduce the courage displayed by people like Tarek and rise above fear and intimidation, becoming people of principle and practicing the justice that we speak of in our own lives. Likewise, in this way, each individual effort represents the initiation of what may prove to be a contagion that can offset a very scary passivity the world over. It is hard to hold faith that the minions of evil will be defeated through self-sacrifice and courage, trust and belief in Allah. But in this test lies a purpose greater than the world and everything in it. a test that Tarek is successfully passing as we speak. It is an idea that is eternal and that surpasses even the concrete and barbed wire of prison walls. In this sense, we all share a responsibility to do our part and share in the effort to prevent further decline. In this way, we are all responsible. In this way, we are all guilty and are all capable of doing more. And only if we are active in doing good and forbidding evil will we be able to be certain that we will not be next. In this way, each and every single one of us is all Tarek Mehanna. Thank you very much.
Allahu Akbar.